The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Officer James Mitchell adjusted his tall black hat and straightened his red uniform. At 28 years old, James had been a member of the Queen's Guard for 5 years, and he took immense pride in his duty to protect the royal family and maintain the dignity of the crown. The summer tourist season was in full swing, and already by 9 in the morning, crowds of visitors had gathered along the palace gates. James stood perfectly still at his post, his expression stoic and professional as cameras flashed around him. Children pointed at his distinctive uniform while their parents snapped photos, and tour guides explained the history and importance of the Queen's Guard. To eager listeners, James had learned early in his career to ignore the constant stream of tourists who tried to make him break character. Some would tell jokes, others would make silly faces, and a few brave souls would even try to touch his uniform or hat. But James remained unmoved, his discipline unwavering. This was more than just a job to him. It was an honor and a tradition that stretched back centuries. On this particular Wednesday morning, everything seemed routine. The changing of the guard had gone smoothly, and James had taken his position at the main entrance without incident. The weather was pleasant, with a light breeze that provided some relief from what promised to be a warm day. Tourists moved in predictable patterns, taking their photos and moving on to the next attraction. What James didn't know was that 3 teenage boys from Manchester were planning something that would turn his ordinary day into an extraordinary test of royal security protocols. The boys, aged 15 to 17, had been dared by their friends back home to do something memorable during their London trip. They had spent the previous evening at their hostel brainstorming ideas, each suggestion more ridiculous than the last. The leader of the group was a boy named Tyler, known among his friends for his pranks and his complete disregard for consequences. His companions, Marcus and Danny, were usually more cautious, but the excitement of being in London and the peer pressure from their friends had clouded their judgment. They had purchased several water balloons from a novelty shop near their hostel, initially planning to have a harmless water fight in a nearby park. But as they approached Buckingham Palace that morning and saw the stoic guard standing at attention, Tyler's mind began working on a different plan. He whispered to his friends about how funny it would be to see one of the famous guards react to an unexpected water balloon. Marcus and Danny initially hesitated, knowing instinctively that this was probably not a good idea. But Tyler's confidence was infectious. The boys positioned themselves strategically in the crowd, with Tyler carrying a small backpack containing 3 filled water balloons. They had researched online and learned that the guards were not supposed to react to distractions, which made Tyler even more determined to try to break through their professional composure. What they failed to research, however, was the serious security implications of their planned prank. As the morning progressed, the boys waited for what they considered the perfect moment. They watched as James maintained his position, noting his steady breathing and unwavering gaze. Other tourists came and went, but the boys remained, building up their courage and waiting for a moment when they thought security might be less attentive. James, meanwhile, was completely unaware of the brewing situation. His training had taught him to be alert to genuine threats, but 3 teenagers with water balloons hardly seemed like a security concern to the casual observer. He focused on his duties, occasionally shifting his weight almost imperceptibly to maintain circulation during his long stint at attention. The palace security system, however, was far more sophisticated than most visitors realized. Multiple layers of protection surrounded the royal residence, from the visible guards like James to plainclothes officers mingling with the crowds, high-tech surveillance systems, and rapid response teams stationed strategically around the perimeter. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, head of the palace's security detail for the day, was monitoring the situation from the control room. Multiple screens showed feeds from dozens of cameras positioned throughout the palace grounds and surrounding areas. Her team was trained to identify potential threats, unusual behavior, and anything that seemed out of place. They had noticed the 3 boys lingering near the main gate for longer than typical tourists, but so far their behavior hadn't crossed any red lines. As the morning wore on, the tension began to build, though only Tyler and his friends were aware of what was coming. The other tourists continued their normal routines, completely oblivious to the fact that they were about to witness an incident that would test the limits of royal security protocols and potentially change how such situations were handled in the future. The stage was set for a confrontation that none of the participants fully understood the consequences of, and James Mitchell was about to face a challenge unlike any he had encountered during his years of service to the Crown. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Tyler made his move. The crowd had thickened as the midday shift approached, providing what he believed was perfect cover. With practiced stealth learned from years of schoolyard pranks, he slowly reached into his backpack and carefully extracted one of the water balloons. The clear plastic stretched tight with cool water caught the sunlight as he concealed it behind his back. Marcus grabbed Tyler's arm, whispering urgently, "Are you mad? Look at all these cameras." But Tyler shrugged him off, his teenage bravado overriding any common sense. Danny stepped back, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what they were about to do. But it was too late to stop his friend. James noticed a slight disturbance in the crowd but maintained his discipline, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead. His peripheral vision, however, was trained to detect unusual movements, and something about the group of teenagers had caught his attention. Years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, even when he couldn't act on them immediately. In the security control room, Detective Inspector Chen's attention was drawn to Monitor 7, which showed the area directly in front of James's position. One of her junior officers, P.C. Watson, pointed at the screen. "Ma'am, look at the boy in the blue jacket. He's got something in his hand behind his back." Chen leaned forward, her experienced eyes immediately recognizing the body language of someone about to do something they shouldn't. She reached for her radio to alert the plainclothes officers in the crowd, but events were unfolding faster than the security protocols could respond. Tyler took 3 quick steps forward, breaking through the front line of tourists. Time seemed to slow as he drew back his arm and launched the water balloon in a high arc toward James. The balloon spun through the air, water sloshing inside the clear plastic, as dozens of smartphone cameras unknowingly captured what would soon become a viral video. The balloon struck James squarely in the chest with a wet smack that could be heard clearly despite the ambient noise of the crowd. Cold water exploded across his pristine red tunic, soaking through the thick wool fabric and running down onto his perfectly polished boots. The impact was significant enough to cause him to take a small step backward, breaking his rigid stance for the first time that morning. For a moment, the entire courtyard fell silent. Tourists stopped talking, children stopped laughing, and even the ever-present sound of camera shutters seemed to pause. James stood there, water dripping from his uniform, his face a mask of professional composure despite the shock and indignity of the moment. Tyler's grin of triumph quickly faded as he realized that every single person in the vicinity was now staring at him. The crowd, which had provided anonymity moments before, now felt like a spotlight focused directly on him. Marcus and Danny had already begun backing away, their faces pale with the realization of what their friend had just done. But the silence lasted only seconds before the royal security apparatus sprang into action with military precision. Within moments of the balloon's impact, plainclothes officers who had been invisible among the tourists suddenly materialized, moving toward Tyler with purposeful strides. Their casual tourist disguises fell away as they revealed their true nature as highly trained security professionals. The first to reach Tyler was Sergeant Amanda Foster, a 10-year veteran of royal protection, who had been posing as a middle-aged woman taking photos of the palace. Her transformation from harmless tourist to law enforcement officer was so swift that several nearby visitors actually jumped backward in surprise. "Stay exactly where you are," Foster commanded, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd with unmistakable authority. Tyler, his teenage confidence evaporating instantly, found himself unable to move as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Meanwhile, 2 more plainclothes officers had smoothly intercepted Marcus and Danny before they could disappear into the crowd. The boys had made it less than 20 feet before finding themselves flanked by security personnel, who seemed to have appeared from thin air. James, still standing at his post despite his soaked uniform, was approached by his sergeant, who had emerged from a nearby guardhouse. "Are you injured, Mitchell?" the sergeant asked quietly, his concern evident despite his professional demeanor. "No, sir, just wet," James replied, maintaining his composure even as water continued to drip from his uniform. His years of training were serving him well, but inside, he was processing the shock of the unexpected assault and wondering what would happen next. The crowd of tourists had now become a mix of confused spectators and excited phone users, with dozens of people recording the unfolding drama. Some seemed thrilled to witness what they perceived as an entertaining incident, while others appeared genuinely concerned about the security implications of what had just occurred. Detective Inspector Chen arrived on the scene within minutes. Having sprinted from the control room as soon as the incident began, her quick assessment of the situation told her everything she needed to know. 3 teenagers had just committed what could be classified as an assault on a member of the Queen's Guard, in full view of hundreds of witnesses and countless recording devices. The boys were quickly surrounded but not yet formally arrested, as Chen wanted to assess the full scope of the situation before determining the appropriate response. Tyler stood frozen, still holding the empty piece of balloon plastic, finally understanding that his moment of teenage rebellion had crossed a line he never should have approached. What had started as a prank was rapidly escalating into a serious security incident that would require careful handling by both the Palace security team and the Metropolitan Police. The next few minutes would determine whether this remained a minor disciplinary matter or became something much more serious. Detective Inspector Chen approached Tyler with the calculated movements of someone who had handled thousands of security incidents throughout her career. Her voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of authority that made every person within earshot pay attention. "Right then, what's your name?" she asked, pulling out her notepad while maintaining eye contact with the now trembling teenager. "T. Tyler Harrison," he stammered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The reality of standing face to face with a senior police officer in front of Buckingham Palace was far different from the scenario he had imagined in his head. "And these are your friends?" Chen nodded toward Marcus and Danny, who were being held nearby by the plainclothes officers. Both boys looked like they wanted to disappear into the ground. "We didn't know he was going to do it," Marcus blurted out, his voice cracking with stress. "We told him it was a bad idea." Chen raised her hand to silence him. "You'll all have your chance to explain yourselves properly. First, I need to understand exactly what happened here, and whether there are any other surprises I should know about." She directed Sergeant Foster to search Tyler's backpack, which revealed 2 additional water balloons, several more empty balloon pieces, and a small water bottle they had been using to fill them. The discovery of the additional balloons immediately elevated the incident from a single, impulsive act to what appeared to be a premeditated plan to target multiple guards. The crowd of tourists had grown larger as word spread through the area that something significant was happening. Many continued filming with their phones, creating a complicated situation for the security team, who needed to control the scene while being mindful of the public relations implications of their response. James remained at his post, though his sergeant had quietly arranged for a replacement guard to be brought from the nearby barracks. Palace protocol dictated that a guard who had been compromised in any way should be relieved of duty and debriefed. But James was determined to maintain his professionalism until properly relieved. "Sir," James said quietly to his sergeant, "I request permission to remain at my post until the proper changing of the guard can be arranged." The sergeant nodded approvingly. "Granted, Mitchell, but medical will want to check you over afterward just as a precaution." Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Chen was conducting a preliminary assessment of the 3 boys. Tyler, at 17, was the oldest and clearly the ringleader. Marcus, 16, seemed genuinely remorseful and kept apologizing to anyone who would listen. Danny, the youngest at 15, appeared to be in shock and hadn't spoken since being detained. "Where are you boys from?" Chen asked, her tone slightly softer as she recognized their youth and genuine fear. "Manchester, ma'am," Tyler replied, using the respectful address almost automatically. "We're here on a school trip." "Well, sort of. We finished our GCSEs and our parents let us come to London for a few days." Chen made notes as he spoke, already beginning to formulate how this incident would be handled. The boys were clearly not terrorists or serious threats to royal security, but their actions had still constituted an assault on a member of the Queen's Guard and a significant breach of palace security protocols. "Do your parents know where you are right now?" she asked. The question seemed to hit Tyler harder than anything else that had happened. The thought of having to call his mother and explain that he was being questioned by police at Buckingham Palace after attacking a royal guard made his face go pale. They think we're at the British Museum today," he admitted quietly. Sergeant Foster approached Chen with an update, Ma'am, we've reviewed the CCTV footage. The boys were loitering in the area for approximately 45 minutes before the incident. They appeared to be planning something, but there's no indication of any other individuals being involved. This information was crucial for Chen's assessment. If the boys had been acting alone, it suggested a spontaneous prank rather than part of any larger security threat. However, the extended planning period meant it wasn't completely impulsive either. Right, Chen said, making her decision. We're going to need to take you 3 to the station for proper interviews. This isn't a game, and there will be consequences. Do any of you have any medical conditions I should know about? Are you on any medications? All 3 boys shook their heads, still too stunned by the rapid escalation of events to fully process what was happening to them. The replacement guard arrived, marching with precise military bearing to relieve James. The changing of the guard happened with the same ceremony and dignity as always, though the wet stain on James's uniform served as a visible reminder of the morning's unusual events. As James was finally able to step down from his post, he felt a mix of relief and professional concern. In 5 years of service, he had never been targeted in such a direct way, and he wondered if this incident might indicate a change in how the public viewed the guards or the monarchy itself. Detective Inspector Chen organized the removal of the 3 boys from the scene, ensuring they were escorted away from the crowds and cameras as quickly as possible. The last thing the palace needed was extended footage of teenagers being arrested that could be taken out of context or used to criticize the security response. As the boys were led away, Tyler turned back once to look at the guard post where James had been standing. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his target hadn't been just a tourist attraction or a symbol, but a real person doing an important job. The weight of that realization would stay with him long after the legal consequences of his actions were resolved. The incident was far from over, but the immediate security response had been swift, professional, and proportionate. Now came the more complex task of determining exactly what charges would be filed and how the case would be handled by the criminal justice system. The Belgravia police station was a bustling hub of activity when Tyler, Marcus, and Danny arrived in separate police vehicles. The boys had been transported from Buckingham Palace under standard procedures, each accompanied by an officer and given the opportunity to contact a parent or guardian. Tyler sat in interview room 2, staring at the stark white walls and metal table, while waiting for his mother to make the 3-hour journey from Manchester. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. What had seemed like harmless fun a few hours earlier now felt like the stupidest decision he had ever made in his young life. Detective Inspector Chen reviewed the case files one more time before beginning the interviews. The charges being considered were serious: assault, breach of the peace, and potentially even offenses under the Public Order Act. However, she also had to consider the ages of the perpetrators and the fact that no actual harm had been done to the guard or any bystanders. In interview room 1, Marcus was crying quietly while his father spoke in hushed, angry tones on his mobile phone with Marcus's mother back home. Mr. Thompson had driven down from Manchester as soon as he received the call, and his face showed a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and deep concern for his son's future. "I just don't understand how you could be so stupid," Mr. Thompson said, shaking his head. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for your university applications? For your entire future?" Marcus wiped his eyes with the tissue provided by the custody sergeant. "I know, Dad, I'm sorry. I tried to talk him out of it, but Tyler wouldn't listen, and I didn't want to look like a coward in front of the others." Meanwhile, in interview room 3, 15-year-old Danny was experiencing a full panic attack. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and the custody nurse had been called to assess his condition. His parents were driving down from Manchester together, but the journey seemed to take forever, and Danny was struggling to cope with the stress of the situation. PC Watson, one of the younger officers assigned to the case, approached Chen with an update. "Ma'am, I've been monitoring social media. The incident is starting to go viral. There are at least 12 different videos of the water balloon hitting the guard, and the hashtag Royal Guard prank is trending on Twitter." Chen sighed deeply. The digital age had complicated every aspect of policing, but incidents involving the royal family were particularly sensitive to public opinion and media coverage. "What's the general reaction?" she asked. "Mixed," Watson replied, scrolling through his tablet. Some people think it's funny and harmless, but there's a strong contingent calling for serious punishment. A few are even suggesting it was disrespectful to the military and the crown. This information would be crucial in determining how to proceed with the case. Public opinion often influenced prosecutorial decisions, especially in high-profile cases involving young offenders. Back at Buckingham Palace, James Mitchell was sitting in the medical office, having his uniform examined for any damage beyond the water staining. The palace had protocols for every conceivable situation, including what to do when a guard's uniform was compromised during duty. "Any soreness or discomfort?" asked the medic, a former army nurse named Patricia who had seen much worse injuries during her military service. "Just my pride," James replied with a wry smile. "Though I have to admit the water was colder than I expected." Patricia chuckled as she made notes in his file. "Well, physically you're fine. The uniform can be cleaned and pressed, though it might take a day or two to remove all the staining completely." James nodded, then asked the question that had been bothering him since the incident. "Patricia, in your opinion, do you think this changes anything? I mean, will people start thinking we're easy targets now?" It was a legitimate concern. The Queen's Guard served both a practical security function and a symbolic role representing the stability and dignity of the monarchy. An incident like this, especially if it became widely publicized, could potentially encourage copycat behavior or undermine public respect for the institution. "I think," Patricia said carefully, "that most reasonable people will see this for what it was, a stupid prank by teenagers who didn't think about the consequences. But you're right to be concerned about precedent." Detective Inspector Chen finally began the formal interviews at 3:30 p.m., starting with Tyler since he was clearly the ringleader and the one who had actually thrown the balloon. His mother, Mrs. Harrison, had arrived looking haggard and deeply embarrassed. She was a single parent who worked 2 jobs to support Tyler and his younger sister, and this incident was the last thing she needed in her already complicated life. "Tyler," Chen began, "I'm going to ask you some questions about what happened this morning. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be used as evidence. Do you understand?" Tyler nodded, glancing at his mother who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "In your own words, can you tell me what led up to you throwing that water balloon at the guard?" Tyler took a deep breath and began to explain. His story was straightforward and matched what the CCTV footage had shown. He described the peer pressure from friends back home, the dare to do something memorable, and his decision to target the guard because he thought it would be funny to see if he could make the stoic soldier react. "Did you consider that this might be illegal?" Chen asked. "Not really," Tyler admitted. "I mean, I knew it wasn't exactly right, but I thought it was just a bit of harmless fun. Like, it was just water, you know? I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Mrs. Harrison spoke for the first time since the interview began. "I'm so sorry, officer. Tyler is usually a good boy, but he sometimes acts without thinking. His father isn't around anymore, and maybe I haven't been strict enough." Chen softened her tone slightly. She had been a police officer long enough to recognize a fundamentally good kid who had made a seriously bad decision. "Mrs. Harrison, no one is suggesting this is your fault. But Tyler does need to understand the serious consequences of his actions." The interview continued for another hour, with Chen gathering all the necessary information for the case file. By the time it was finished, Tyler was genuinely remorseful and seemed to understand the gravity of what he had done. The interviews with Marcus and Danny followed similar patterns, though both boys were more emotional and seemed to better understand from the beginning how serious the situation was. Marcus, in particular, was articulate about his regret and his recognition that peer pressure was no excuse for poor judgment. As the day wore on, Chen found herself in the difficult position of balancing justice with compassion, public interest with practical considerations, and the need to send a strong message about respecting royal security, with the recognition that these were children who had made a mistake. 3 days after the incident, Detective Inspector Chen sat in her office reviewing the complete case file while preparing her recommendations for the Crown Prosecution Service. The media attention had continued to grow, with major news outlets picking up the story and public debate raging on social media about appropriate punishment for the 3 boys. The legal situation was complex. While the boys had clearly committed assault and breach of the peace, their ages, lack of criminal history, and the non-violent nature of their actions created arguments for leniency. Chen had spent considerable time consulting with legal experts, youth crime specialists, and even palace officials to determine the most appropriate course of action. Her phone buzzed with a text message from PC Watson. Channel 4 News wants a statement about the Royal Guard incident. How should I respond? Chen sighed and typed back, standard response. Investigation ongoing. No further comment at this time. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant the incident was being taken seriously and might deter others from similar behavior. On the other hand, it was putting enormous pressure on all parties involved to reach a resolution quickly, potentially before all factors could be properly considered. Meanwhile, back in Manchester, Tyler Harrison was struggling with his newfound notoriety. Several videos of the incident had been shared hundreds of thousands of times, and his face was clearly visible in most of them. Friends at school were divided between those who thought he was a legend and those who were appalled by his behavior. His mother had taken time off work to deal with the situation, which they could ill afford financially. The stress was taking a toll on the entire family, especially Tyler's younger sister Emma, who was being teased at school about her brother's actions. "Mum," Tyler said one evening as they sat in their small living room, "I keep thinking about that guard. Do you think he's okay? I mean, not physically, but do you think I've messed up his life too?" Mrs. Harrison looked at her son, seeing a maturity in his question that gave her hope. "I don't know, love, but the fact that you're thinking about him shows you're learning from this." Tyler had spent hours online reading about the Queen's Guard, learning about their training, their dedication, and the pride they took in their service. The more he learned, the worse he felt about what he had done. The Guard wasn't just a tourist attraction or a symbol. He was a real person with a real job, and Tyler had made that job harder. James Mitchell, the guard who had been targeted, was dealing with his own complicated feelings about the incident. He had been interviewed by Internal Affairs, debriefed by his superiors, and even consulted by the palace's public relations team about potential media statements. The important thing, his commanding officer had told him, is that you maintained your composure and professionalism throughout the incident. Your conduct was exemplary under difficult circumstances. But James wasn't thinking about his conduct. He was thinking about the three boys and wondering what would happen to them. He had been 15 once, and while he had never done anything as foolish as throwing a water balloon at a royal guard, he remembered the poor decision-making that came with teenage years. During his off-duty hours, James found himself researching the boys' backgrounds online. He learned that Tyler was from a single-parent family, that Marcus was an excellent student with plans for university, and that Danny was the youngest and seemed to have been caught up in something bigger than himself. The more James learned, the more conflicted he felt about the appropriate response to their actions. Detective Inspector Chen received an unexpected call on Thursday afternoon. The caller identified himself as Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Morrison, representing the Household Division, which oversees all Royal Guard units. "Detective Inspector," Morrison said in his crisp military accent, "I'm calling to discuss the incident involving our guardsmen. We've been following the case closely and I wanted to share our perspective." "Of course, sir. What are your thoughts?" "Well, naturally we take any assault on our personnel very seriously. However, we also recognize that these were young people who made a poor decision rather than genuine threats to security. Our guardsman, Officer Mitchell, has actually requested that we consider the boys' ages and circumstances when determining how to proceed." This was unexpected information that could significantly influence the case. "Are you saying the victim is advocating for leniency?" "Not exactly leniency," Morrison clarified, "but perhaps a resolution that serves the interests of justice while also serving as an educational opportunity. These boys clearly didn't understand the significance of their actions or the potential consequences." Chen made detailed notes as Morrison continued. "We would be interested in exploring alternatives to traditional prosecution, if such options exist. Something that would ensure the boys understand the seriousness of their actions, while not destroying their futures over a moment of poor judgment." After the call ended, Chen sat back in her chair, considering this new dimension to the case. The victim himself, through his military chain of command, was suggesting a restorative rather than purely punitive approach. She called the youth justice team to discuss alternative approaches. Restorative justice programs had shown success in cases involving young offenders, particularly when the harm was more symbolic than physical, and when both victims and perpetrators were willing to participate. The key, explained Sarah Mills, the youth justice coordinator, would be ensuring that the boys genuinely understand the impact of their actions, not just on the individual guard but on the institution he represents. It would also need to include some form of meaningful consequence and community service. By Friday, Chen had drafted her recommendations. Rather than pursuing traditional prosecution, she was recommending a restorative justice approach that would include formal apologies, community service, educational components about the role and importance of the military, and ongoing monitoring to ensure the boys learned from their experience. The proposal would need approval from multiple agencies and officials, but Chen believed it represented the best balance of justice, education, and rehabilitation. It would also send a clear message that such behavior was unacceptable while recognizing the reality that these were children who had made a serious mistake. The final decision would ultimately rest with the Crown Prosecution Service, but Chen was hopeful that her recommendation would be accepted. She had seen too many young lives derailed by single moments of poor judgment, and she believed that justice could be served without destroying the futures of 3 boys who had learned a hard lesson about actions and consequences. 6 weeks after the water balloon incident, Tyler Harrison stood nervously outside Wellington Barracks, dressed in his best clothes and clutching a carefully written letter. Beside him, Marcus and Danny looked equally anxious as they prepared for what would be one of the most important meetings of their young lives. The Crown Prosecution Service had accepted Detective Inspector Chen's recommendation for restorative justice, but the process had been neither quick nor easy. All 3 boys had spent weeks in community service, working with veterans organizations and learning about military history and the role of the armed forces in British society. Tyler had volunteered at a local veterans care home, where he had listened to stories from men and women who had served their country in wars and peacekeeping missions around the world. The experience had been eye-opening, giving him a perspective on military service that he had never considered before. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked quietly as they approached the barracks entrance. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," Tyler replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Inside the barracks, James Mitchell was preparing for the meeting with mixed emotions. He had voluntarily participated in the restorative justice process, believing it was the right thing to do, but he wasn't sure what to expect from face-to-face encounters with the boys who had targeted him. His commanding officer had been supportive of his decision. "This is about more than punishment," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had explained. "It's about education, understanding, and perhaps preventing similar incidents in the future." The meeting took place in a small conference room with Chen facilitating the discussion. Also present were the boys' parents, a youth justice coordinator, and a representative from the palace security team. The atmosphere was formal but not hostile, designed to encourage honest dialogue rather than confrontation. Chen began by explaining the purpose of the meeting and the ground rules for discussion. Each party would have the opportunity to speak without interruption, share their perspectives on the incident, and work toward mutual understanding and resolution. Tyler was the first to address James directly. His hands shook as he read from his prepared statement, but his voice grew stronger as he continued. "Officer Mitchell, I want to start by saying how sorry I am for what I did to you. When I threw that water balloon, I wasn't thinking of you as a real person doing an important job. I was just thinking about impressing my friends and having a laugh. But I've learned a lot since then about what you and the other guards do, and I understand now that what I did was not just wrong, but disrespectful to you and everything you represent." He paused, looking directly at James before continuing. "I've been working at a veterans home, and I've heard stories about people who have served our country with honor and dedication. I realize now that you're part of that tradition, and I'm genuinely ashamed of how I treated you." Marcus spoke next, expressing his regret for not doing more to stop the incident and acknowledging that peer pressure was no excuse for poor judgment. Danny, still the youngest and most emotional of the 3, struggled through his apology but managed to convey his genuine remorse. When it was James's turn to speak, he had prepared his own statement, but found himself setting aside his notes to speak from the heart. "I want you boys to know that I appreciate your apologies, and I can see that they're genuine. What happened that day was shocking and humiliating. But I also understand that you're young and that young people sometimes make mistakes. What's important is that you learn from those mistakes." He looked at each of them in turn. "I chose to serve as a Queen's Guard because I believe in duty, honor, and service to something bigger than myself. When you threw that balloon, you weren't just attacking me, you were attacking those values. But I also believe in forgiveness and second chances." James's words had a profound impact on all three boys, but especially on Tyler, who had been carrying the heaviest burden of guilt. The formal part of the restorative justice process included the boys agreeing to complete 200 hours of community service each, with a focus on supporting military veterans and their families. They would also participate in an educational program about British military history and the constitutional role of the monarchy. Additionally, Tyler would write a formal letter of apology to be included in his permanent record, and all three boys would be required to attend monthly check-ins with the youth justice team for 6 months to ensure they were staying out of trouble. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the resolution came when James made an unexpected offer. "I'd like to invite you boys to attend a changing of the guard ceremony as my guests," he said. "Not as tourists, but as people who understand what they're watching. I think it might help you appreciate the tradition and ceremony in a way you couldn't before." The boys accepted gratefully, and 2 weeks later, they found themselves standing in a special viewing area at Buckingham Palace, watching the precise military choreography they had so carelessly disrupted weeks earlier. This time, however, they saw it through completely different eyes. Tyler watched James march with perfect posture and timing, his uniform immaculate, his bearing dignified and proud. The teenager found himself filled with respect for the discipline and dedication required to perform such a role day after day, in all weather conditions, while maintaining the highest standards of military bearing. After the ceremony, James approached them in civilian clothes, looking remarkably different without his famous red tunic and tall black hat. "So what did you think?" he asked. "It was incredible," Marcus replied immediately. "I had no idea how much training and skill went into it. The precision, the timing, the history behind it all." Tyler nodded enthusiastically. "I keep thinking about how stupid I was. You weren't just standing there for tourists to look at. You were doing something really important, something that connects to hundreds of years of British history and tradition." James smiled, pleased that his invitation had achieved its intended purpose. "That's exactly right. We're not just ceremonial figures or tourist attractions. We're active serving soldiers with a proud history and important responsibilities." Danny, who had remained quiet during most of the interaction, finally spoke up. "Officer Mitchell, do you think we could ever... would it be possible for us to learn more about military service? Not just as punishment, but because we're actually interested now." The question surprised everyone, including Danny himself, but it reflected a genuine transformation that had taken place in all three boys during the restorative justice process. James exchanged glances with the youth coordinator, who nodded encouragingly. "I think that could definitely be arranged. There are cadet programs, military history societies, and volunteer opportunities with veterans organizations. If you're genuinely interested, there are lots of ways to learn more and even contribute positively to the military community." The meeting concluded with handshakes all around and a sense that justice had been served in a way that benefited everyone involved. The boys had learned valuable lessons about respect, responsibility, and the consequences of their actions. James felt that his profession and the institution he served had been properly defended, while also demonstrating the values of forgiveness and education that the military embodied. Detective Inspector Chen watched the proceedings with satisfaction, knowing that this case would serve as a model for handling similar situations in the future. The restorative justice approach had achieved what traditional prosecution might not have: genuine understanding, remorse, and positive change. 6 months later, Tyler, Marcus, and Danny had all successfully completed their community service and educational requirements. Tyler had become a regular volunteer at the Veterans Home and was considering a career in social work. Marcus had joined his school's combined cadet force and was exploring the possibility of military service after university. Danny had discovered a passion for military history and was planning to study it at A-level. The incident, which had started as a thoughtless prank, had ultimately become a catalyst for positive change in all their lives. They had learned that actions have consequences, but also that those consequences could be opportunities for growth and understanding rather than just punishment. James Mitchell continued his service as a Queen's Guard with renewed appreciation for the role he played in representing British values and traditions. The incident had tested his professionalism and composure, but it had also reminded him of the positive impact that forgiveness and education could have on young people who had lost their way. The case became a template for how similar incidents would be handled in the future, demonstrating that justice could be both firm and compassionate, holding young offenders accountable, while also giving them the opportunity to learn, grow, and contribute positively to society. As Tyler later reflected in his final report to the Youth Justice Team, "I learned that respect isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding why those rules exist and what they protect. I also learned that good people will give you a second chance if you prove you deserve it, but you have to do the work to earn that chance." The water balloon that had seemed so harmless in Tyler's teenage mind had created ripples that extended far beyond that single moment at Buckingham Palace, ultimately teaching everyone involved valuable lessons about responsibility, respect, redemption, and the power of choosing education over retribution.